Hello, and welcome to Haaretz Insider, an exclusive online Q&A for subscribers. I'm Simon Spungin, and I'm joined today by Anshel Pfeffer.
How are you, Simon?
How are you, Anshel?
Not bad.
Good. So we're sitting in a very nice television studio here at Haaretz. Behind us there, working on tomorrow's edition of the newspaper. And we're here to answer our subscribers' questions about Bibi Netanyahu. Because as we all know, yesterday or 2 days ago, Bibi became Israel's longest serving prime minister. He's been in power in total for 13 years and 100 and something days.
130 days and counting.
And counting, indeed. So just to put that into some kind of perspective and to use a medium that I think that Netanyahu himself would approve of, here's a little visual aid that I made up earlier. Between less than 10 years, less than a decade in power, no big deal at all. Between 10 and 20 years, that's where we find people like Vladimir Putin, Angela Merkel, Viktor Orban, and of course Bibi.
Good group.
But there are two more levels of longevity. Idris Deby, for example, has been running Chad for 28 years, and Paul Biya has been top dog in Cameroon for over 44 years. So Bibi's not quite a world record breaker just yet. Anshel, you've written a biography of Bibi, strategically placed here on the desk in front of you, and you probably know him better than anybody else in this room or maybe even in this building. So I'm going to invoke insider privilege here and ask you the first question myself. I hope our subscribers will bear with me for just a minute. Do you think that Netanyahu celebrated over the weekend this milestone?
I know he did. I spoke to people who were with him over the weekend, and they said that he had a historic feeling.
Despite the political and legal turmoil, the court cases, the upcoming do-over election, he was still in the mood to celebrate?
Well, I think it's these things which make him feel even more of a feeling of satisfaction. The fact that there are so many challenges to him remaining in office, and so far he's overcome them. And he's overcome so many other challenges over the years. And no one believed back in 1996 when he was 25 points behind in the polls, behind Shimon Peres 3 months before the election. No one believed he would ever be prime minister, let alone the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. So I think he's got a feeling of satisfaction. And I think that when he sees the array of legal obstacles to him continuing office, as you mentioned, the do-over election, which his prospects aren't great, I think he feels even more satisfaction that he's managed to break what is a historic record.
Do you think he enjoyed Donald Trump's tweet?
Oh, I'm sure he loved the fact that the President of the United States
anybody missed
was celebrating what Trump's got now, 44 million or 46 million followers. And I think Netanyahu derives some satisfaction from having that celebrated by the President of the United States.
If anybody can't read this, what Trump wrote is that Israel has become a technology powerhouse and a world-class economy. Not sure what a world-class economy is exactly, but never mind. And he goes on to, say,
someone wrote that for Trump, obviously. So it's
right.
So
okay.
They knew exactly what to say to make Netanyahu feel warm and satisfied.
The editor in me is looking for the hyphen in world-class economy, but I'm going to let that slide too. He goes on to say that Bibi has led Israel with a commitment to the values of democracy, freedom and equality and equal opportunity that both our nations cherish and share. Does that ring a little hollow?
Someone noticed the fact that he said equal opportunity but not equal rights. So there's that was a telling distinction, and they didn't go that far even to say there's equal rights in Israel. But these are Trump's tweets. If Trump writes them himself, then we think they're the ravings of a lunatic, and if it's written for him, then these are things which are done by the team there who want Netanyahu to feel happy, and this is the least they can do, because he's not going to be going probably to Washington during this campaign. So at least he gets a couple of tweets.
Anybody who's out there watching, I remind you, please send in your questions. Click raise your hand. You can ask your question directly to Anshel. I'll filter it through me to Anshel. We actually got a couple of questions in before the broadcast started. So let's start with this one in from Annabelle, who says that over the past 10 years of Netanyahu, the number of Israelis killed in terror attacks has dropped dramatically. And she wants to know, isn't that the ultimate test for an Israeli leader?
Yes,
whatever means are used to achieve it.
I agree. You have to give Netanyahu credit for the fact that he is the prime minister, the elected prime minister with the lowest casualty rate of any prime minister in Israel's history,
including in wartime as well as terror activities.
That's usually what contributes to the average wartime terror activities, etc. And he is the prime. Before he was the longest serving prime minister, he was already the prime minister with the lowest average, lowest casualty average. So yes, he deserves credit for that. Is that the ultimate? I think the ultimate test is what kind of a country the prime minister builds long term. Now, you could argue that Netanyahu deserves credit for what's happening now. The question is what's going to happen in the future. Is Netanyahu creating the conditions whereby Israel will be at peace, not just during his term in office, but also those of his successors, and not just Israel living at peace, but not just Israel not having less wars, Israel living at peace with its neighbors, which creates a better situation both for Israelis and for Palestinians and for Israel's neighbors. And Netanyahu hasn't done that. He's kept everything static here. He hasn't gone to big wars, to his credit. He hasn't gone to peace either. Now, he would argue, if he was sitting here, that when my predecessors said they were going to peace, instead we got terror attacks and buses blowing up and so on, and he would have a point. But he hasn't used the fact that he does have this very favorable diplomatic climate. There's no real pressure on Israel. Israel now could push for some kind of a solution, whether a permanent solution or perhaps an interim solution with the Palestinians, and do so from the best position Israel's ever been in. Trump is not creating any kind of pressure and expectations in Israel. The Europeans, who had at times were pressuring Israel, now are totally focused on their own problems. The Arab world is more interested in doing business with Israel, whether it's against Iran or whether it's trade. So this will be the moment to actually use all these opportunities and get the best possible deal from Israel's perspective, without anybody forcing something on Israel. But he hasn't done that.
But he hasn't done. Why hasn't he done that? Why?
Because he doesn't.
He's capable of doing it. Does he not believe it's possible?
Why? I don't think he believes it's possible. B, I think he believes that he has said so and he's written so, that he thinks time is working in Israel's advantage, and if Israel remains steadfast and does not make any concession to the Palestinians, in the end, the Palestinians will give up. So he thinks that's the better situation. He thinks that why take any risks when Israel is in a position of strength.
Okay, we have a question in from Josh in Washington, who wants to know, as it's a question we ask in this building quite a lot, why Netanyahu so rarely gives interviews to the Israeli press.
Well, it's very interesting when you see Netanyahu giving an interview, and usually it's in the week before the election. He suddenly gives a whole series of interviews to every possible kind of media. Almost, you see, he's enjoying it, even when he gets interviewed by a really tough. Actually, even more when the interviewer is giving him a hard time. He revels in it. He likes that thrust and parry of the tough interview. He's always been like that. He doesn't give interviews outside election periods because he knows it doesn't work in his interest. He has nothing to gain by giving an interview when he can dominate and dictate the media agenda and the public agenda through other means. Why allow someone else to have any kind of influence over his message? He can regulate the message himself, and also he creates this hunger amongst Israeli journalists, amongst Israeli media, that the moment he's going to come and say, okay, now I'm going to give you an interview, he's going to get a full half hour on the television without asking anything.
Even if he's reading from the same page.
In the past, in his first term, between 1999, 99, he was giving interviews the whole time, and at some point it lost the currency lost any value. Now every time he's willing to talk to the media, which is rare, we're all going to be there, and we're all going to be hanging on every word, because we all want to see what he has to say. And let's be fair, he's a great performer, and he gives value for money when he's on the television. However, he knows that he's nothing to gain when it's not the crunch period before the election.
Okay, here's one you can get your teeth into, Anshel. Ben-Zion Netanyahu, Professor Ben-Zion Netanyahu, Bibi's father, once said that Bibi wasn't a good prime minister in his first term of office. He would have been a great foreign minister. He said. What did he mean by that?
Well, I think he was very Benjamin Netanyahu, in his writing, in his research of Jewish history, has always been extremely critical of Jewish leadership. It's interesting that a man whose life was given to writing about Jewish history was always very harsh about the political and diplomatic level of Jewish leaders. You know, he wrote coruscatingly about the leadership of the Spanish Jewish community during the period leading up to the Spanish expulsion, and I think he was a very, very harsh judge. He didn't say about anyone else, I would prefer so and so be Prime Minister Netanyahu. He was just he wasn't the kind of person to give even his own son easy praise, and he didn't praise anybody really when it comes to leadership.
Here's a question from Shoshana in Tel Aviv, who wants to know whether Netanyahu's coalition really has crumbled finally and completely now that Shaked is in charge of the right wing. And as a follow-up question, what's the deal between Sarah Netanyahu
so
and
let's start
Ayelet
before
Shaked?
we get to Sarah. Netanyahu's coalition began to crumble the moment Lieberman decided that he doesn't want to join the coalition. The idea that all the right-wing parties and all the religious parties would automatically sit in Netanyahu's coalition. All he had to do was just like make sure that they would have enough seats, these parties together, to have a majority. That idea crumbled when Lieberman said, "I'm not going to sit in the same coalition with the Orthodox parties." He found his excuse was the draft law, but really he's decided he wants to bring Netanyahu down, and the way to do that is to break this paradigm that all the religious and all the right-wing parties will automatically sit in Netanyahu's coalition. It happened before Shaked became the leader of New Right. We're talking now less than 24 hours ago, but with the moment Shaked became, and even in previous days when we were hearing Bennett in interviews saying, we won't necessarily endorse Netanyahu after this election in September. We could endorse another right-wing candidate. He wouldn't say who another right-wing candidate could be, but the fact that we now have two right-wing parties who are not automatically endorsing Netanyahu does mean that the coalition is crumbling. Before the election, to say we won't necessarily endorse Netanyahu is an admission that Netanyahu is no longer seen by many right-wingers as necessarily the best prime minister.
So who are the alternatives? I was seeing on
it's a great question.
We don't have they did a poll amongst right-wing voters, people who identify as right-wing voters, and they firmly picked either Bennett or Shaked as future leaders of the right.
I mean, look, they're not going to win enough. Their party, even if they manage to bring all the right-wing parties, which are not liquid together, and it won't be Lieberman as well. So there'll be, the least we'll have 3 right-wing parties running in this election. They won't be the largest, and therefore neither of them will be a candidate to be prime minister. But the next prime minister maybe Benny Gantz, because maybe they'll find a way to bring a centre-right coalition together. Some of Likud will sit in it, or there won't be a need for Likud to sit in. Or at some point, Netanyahu will have to step down and no longer be the leader of Likud. We can't to work out the scenario in which it's going to happen. It's very difficult because Likud leaders leave on their own terms usually, or they die in office. So it's hard for us to work out how if Likud will ever force Netanyahu out. They probably wouldn't. They probably wait for him to somehow leave on his own accord. The timing, the manner of his departure, whether there'll be an alternative coalition without him first, and then he will no longer be prime minister. All these things, any of the experts who are going to tell you what's going to happen in 2 months from now are very brave, are extremely brave.
For sure.
But
for sure. Tell me, is there any way that we can talk about Sarah Netanyahu?
So what is it
without being gossipy?
I mean, the things are it's well documented. Shaked, together with Naftali Bennett, they were running Netanyahu's office when Netanyahu was leader of opposition 13, 14 years ago. They had a falling out with Sarah, both of them, over matters of letting her know what Netanyahu's schedule was, where he was at every given moment. There were things being said that, like, madam, we work for your husband, we don't work for you. That totally didn't go down very well. And there were the other question was who was going to pay them their salaries. A leader of the opposition doesn't have that many members of staff, so their salary was paid elsewhere. Some of them, at some point, Sarah Netanyahu wasn't pleased that the money may have been coming from an account that she expected not to be going to her husband's political office. There were differences over those things.
So it is what you're saying. I just want to understand.
It is personal. It's personal. It's
completely personal, and the personal animosity between the prime minister's wife and a leading member of the Knesset or ex.
Well, when Shaked was on the prime ministerial delegations abroad, she did not fly on the prime minister's plane.
If they wrote that in the West Wing or in House of Cards, they wouldn't believe it. All right, let's move on. Meryl G has a question. Do you see a way forward to a fair two-state solution with a divided Jerusalem, settlements over the Green Line incorporated into Israel with corresponding land swap, or some version thereof, assuming Bibi is no longer in office?
Well, there's what was the word here? Fair. What is fair?
But any two-state solution.
Let's turn the question around. I don't see any solution with Netanyahu, because Netanyahu does not believe in a solution. By the way, neither did Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion also said that there is no way to solve this conflict between the Arabs living. He didn't call them Palestinians. No one called them Palestinians then, because Palestinians were also the Jews living here. But he didn't see a solution between the two nations living between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. He didn't see a way for them to agree on how to divide the land. And Netanyahu is in that mold. Now, 5 prime ministers in the last quarter of a century, Rabin, Peres, Sharon, Olmert, and Barak, all tried in different ways, some in the same ways and some in different ways, to try and change the paradigm between Israel and the Palestinians and work out some way of sharing, of finding a solution of this land. Netanyahu has pulled the clock backwards and said, no, I don't believe there's a way to do it. The only way to do it is to stick to our guns until the Palestinians give up. He doesn't see the Palestinians as being a proper, independent national entity, which he has to really take into consideration. He sees them at the most as being an offshoot of the wider Arab nation. So the Arab states are accepting us, the Palestinians will just have to accept that as well.
Okay, this is an interesting question from Martin in Manchester, who wants to know whether, in your opinion, Netanyahu genuinely shares the worldviews of some of his closest allies, and he mentions Bolsonaro, Orban, Trump specifically, or whether these are nothing more than alliances of convenience for Netanyahu.
Well, I think there are elements in which he shares, but I don't think it's so much of an ideology, rather as a way of conducting politics. Netanyahu is a Jewish nationalist, but he's not necessarily, at least he certainly wasn't in the past, as gung-ho as some of those names you mentioned in bringing down the judiciary, in challenging the old, what he likes to call nowadays the old elites. These are things that he's mainly used as convenience. We haven't seen Netanyahu in the last 10 years really taking any serious steps against the courts, the way he was talking that he would do perhaps now after the election in April. So it's more pragmatic. He doesn't want to be pushed out of office. So for those reasons, he will try and diminish the power of the courts to try and to their powers to remove him if he's indeed indicted. But it's not an ideology. It's not a goal. I think it's less of an ideology than it is. But I think also if you look at some of those leaders, it's more of a way of staying in power. You mentioned Orban. Orban also made this sort of trajectory from being seen as a liberal, as he is today, as being seen as semi-autocrat. It goes with the time spent in power. Almost any leader who spends too long in power gets these autocratic tendencies.
Here's a short follow-up question. You mentioned that Netanyahu hasn't done anything ideological and to counter the courts, the power of the courts in the last 10 years. Has he done anything ideological at all in the past 10 years?
I think Netanyahu's ideology is what we said before. It's to stick to the status quo. Netanyahu's solution is more or less Netanyahu's solution for the Palestinian issue is more or less today's situation. He sees a series of semi-autonomous enclaves in Gaza and in the West Bank, where the Palestinians will have, like I say, semi-autonomy, but no external control. Certainly it'll be demilitarized. It won't be a real state. The most he's willing to say, if you want to call that a state, call that a state, but it's not. Everyone knows it's not a state. And that's the situation today. That is where the Oslo process stopped in 1996. That
Right.
was, what you could add 1997, the pullback from Hebron, which was forced on Netanyahu, and the few changes made after the Y River conference at the end of '98. So this static situation, what we've had, also then afterwards disengagement from Gaza. So all these things that were done either in the periods of Rabin and Peres or in Sharon and a bit during his first term in office, this is the most he's prepared to give. What the Palestinians have today, you could argue it's nothing, but what they do have today in the form of control of Gaza and parts of the West Bank, about 40% area A and area B, that is what Netanyahu's willing to give. And that is part of the ideology where he's not willing to see a national entity coming into being between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. And he's not going, he doesn't support transfer, he doesn't support kicking 5 million Palestinians out, but this is all he's going to give them. The ideology here is that they are not a nation. We saw just a few days ago how effusive it was in his praise on Twitter of his son's speech in America, where that's what his son said.
Right.
He didn't try and distance himself from that. He may not say so in so many words nowadays, but he does not see the Palestinians as being a unique Arab nation. He sees them as being at the most sort of an outpost of a wider Arab world.
Okay. DC think tank, who I'm going to assume is in Washington,
name.
Asks, how do you rate Netanyahu on the national security level? Iran, Syria, the Palestinians we've talked about. What about the regional issues? How's his handling of regional challenges been?
I think that if you take into account the fact that the last 10 years of Netanyahu in power have included all the by now we're 8.5 years of what began as the Arab Spring. Now we've got different names for it. I think he's handled it very well. I think he's isolated Israel from most of it. He's managed to keep Israel more or less prosperous, relatively secure in this period. We've seen what's happened in the countries around. You can't argue that he hasn't handled that well. And I think that that what's been happening in Syria, most of the time beneath the radar campaign against the Iranian president Syria, it hasn't been a total success because the Iranians are still there. But the level of the Iranian entrenchment, the bases that the Iranians wanted to set up there, they haven't come into being. So I think that has been handled quite well. And I have to give, and I've written it before, I think that even Netanyahu's political rivals would have to give him a lot of credit for that.
I've been asked to point out we have only a few more minutes to go. If you want to send in more questions, please hurry. Lawrence has a question about UK politics. I think we can take a break from Bibi for a second to talk about UK politics. It's something that you've written about occasionally.
I think Boris Johnson is going to be one of the most Bibi-like politicians in the world, because I think he's much more like Bibi than he is like Trump. He uses the same kind of nationalism, populism, but unlike Trump, who is not extremely knowledgeable and probably has never read a book, Boris, like Netanyahu, does have an elite education, is extremely clever, clearly well-read. Whatever he chooses to do with that education is another matter. But I think there's, and unlike Netanyahu, he's a professional politician, unlike Donald Trump, who's an almost accidental politician.
So Lawrence wants to ask, not about the next British Prime Minister, about the next not British Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn, asks whether he should step aside as leader of the Labour Party to allow the party to move on to fresher pastures and to put the anti-Semitism crisis behind it.
Well, there's no question that Labour has become tainted over the last few years, and I don't think that Corbyn...
Will Corbyn's resignation allow the party to move on, though?
Well, it also depends who's going to come after Corbyn, but I think the anti-Semitism issue comes along with another major issue, is the Labour Party's total ineffective handling of Brexit. Britain... Britain has got, you and I. Let's remind everyone we're northern lads from England, and we both. I think in our lifetimes there's been a worse British government. Now, I heard someone say the other day that there can be useless governments and there can be useless oppositions, but this is the first time in English history that there's been a useless government and useless opposition simultaneously. And the reason that Labour is useless is Jeremy Corbyn. For Labour, for not just the anti-Semitism issue, Britain needs a better government and to have a go back, you need a better opposition. And back to here, one of the reasons Netanyahu stayed for so long is the opposition here has been hopeless for so long. And that his longevity at the end of the day is very much down to the weakness of the competition.
I'm going to go back now to Meryl G, who's asked us to clarify something with her question.
She's very insistent.
She absolutely is, and we welcome that. She says the fair two-state solution that she was talking about includes a divided Jerusalem, Green Line settlements incorporated into Israel with corresponding land swaps or some vision thereof. And specifically, she wants to know, is any of that possible or presumably more possible?
Okay, but so Meryl's question is not about Bibi. It's about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think what we've seen with all the leaders who have done various important moves, whether it's vis-a-vis Egypt, Menachem Begin, and whether it's Sharon getting out of Gaza, Rabin and Peres initiating the Oslo process, is that it has been down to leadership. Nobody believed when Menachem Begin came into power and said that he would be the first Israeli leader to achieve a peace solution with a major Arab nation, certainly not relinquish the entire Sinai Peninsula. And Begin did it. There were Sadat opened the door by coming and speaking in the Knesset in 1977. But there was already before that there were quiet discussions, and he knew that everyone knew what he was going to get, and knew that he had been given some kind of assurance that Begin would deliver. So the fact that it was being done, it was down to leadership. If Netanyahu would tomorrow announce that, you know what, I've changed my mind, or I'm going to explain to you now why the two-state solution, as envisaged in the Clinton parameters or whatever, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do just that. 70% of Israelis would be behind him. Yes, maybe half of Likud and the far right would say you're a traitor. But 70% of Israelis would support him tomorrow if he went and said, I'm going to give the whole of the West Bank and part of Jerusalem to the Palestinians and Gaza and everything. That would work tomorrow. Now, Benny Gantz, if he's tomorrow Prime Minister, I don't see him having that leadership either. He's fudging the question. Right. If Israel has a leader who's really willing to take the risk and put his foot down or her foot down and say, this is what I'm going to do, I think the country will go along with them. So it's not about yes Netanyahu, not no Netanyahu. It's about one leader being willing to do that and change the paradigm. Because before Rabin and Peres talked about Oslo, the majority of Israelis were against talking to the PLO. They had to go along and break that taboo. The moment the Prime Minister breaks a taboo, then everything is possible.
Leadership first. We're going to wrap it up. One final question. Debbie in Dusseldorf wants to know, with 2 months to the election, will Netanyahu make a final overture towards Arab states before the election? A visit to Saudi Arabia sounds a little far-fetched, but maybe flying through Saudi airspace to India, visiting Morocco. What kind of October surprise or pre-election surprise do you think he's going to
Well, it's called a surprise, and therefore we don't know what the surprise is going to be. But
we're expecting a surprise.
I don't see the Saudis allowing his plane to fly into their airspace right now, because on the eve of election, why should they? What have they got to gain from it? They've already given from their perspective quite a major concession by allowing Air India to fly over through their airspace every day, or three times a week between Delhi and Tel Aviv. And I think that's as far as they're willing to go out in the open right now. We may see a visit by Netanyahu to one of the more minor states, like he was in Oman. Right. There are expectations, perhaps Bahrain. That's not that won't surprise anybody. I don't think that at this point, and I think the Saudis have as much as we're looking at them and trying to work out if MBS is on the up or the down, they know nothing else on the down as well. I don't think they will now give him a major concession. But like you said,
it's a surprise. Surprise. We're going to wrap it up
Debbie
now.
From Dusseldorf.
Anshel, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to all of our subscribers who joined us. Make sure you keep an eye on Haaretz.com and on the newsletters to find out when we'll be back for another Haaretz Insider. Good evening.